Another lovely day as the children play. I think to myself whenever we're together, heaven is a place on earth. And
things started going bad, and I sort of ended up slowly going there, and the domestication / civilization part of it kind of flows out of that. And at the same time, actually, quite by accident, in the 80s, I discovered the anthropology literature, which was unknown to me. I was more of a Frankfurt School kind of character, social theory, but not. I had no interest in prehistory. What would be the point of that? Well, that was just the light bulb went on. I just thought this people actually lived in very sound ways, in healthy ways, in egalitarian ways, all that stuff which seemed like just kind of nothing but utopia. It's there in the literature. It's just full of it. I mean, I didn't know that. And then, that just changed my thinking very basically. So the primitivism part comes in, anarcho-primitivism. That was a joke at first. The leftists and others laughed at us and said, well, you're primitivists. So that's how quaint. What are you talking about? Well, we sort of embrace it. We don't see primitivism as a pejorative, quite the other way around. It's simplicity, the primitive. That's where we want to go.
Right, right. I mean, there is something like, even in the word like prime, isn't that like first or something?
Sure, primal, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of sounds like it's like, the stigma it has around in our culture is kind of negative, but so, when I tell people, it's almost, because there's so much craziness out there these days, like with the flat earthers running around and all this. Yep. And then it kind of comes off like that in a lot of ways, unfortunately, when I tell people, I think that, and this is kind of how I digest it for people when I'm trying to explain the primitivist thing. I say, I think that the only way to live on a planet sustainably as a human is to be hunter-gatherers. And then all of a sudden they think like, well, that's, just the way that hits people is it's just insane. It's like, well, what about cars and what about medicine and what about, how do you deal with that?
Well, I probably tend to take it a little more slowly, rather than leap to the hunter-gatherer thing. I don't know, maybe that could make it more palatable if you go kind of slowly with that. I mean, I don't know. I don't know. Of course, we're supposed to take everything for granted. Every part of technology. I mean, but I think one way to go with that is to look at the promises and the claims of technology, of the technological society. And you find rapidly they're all false. Does it give us a healthier life? Absolutely not.
Right.
Absolutely not. And virtually everybody will agree with you on that. So then you won half the battle right there. Well, then what do you conclude from that?
Right.
So isn't it a matter of doing something different? Replacing it with something else?
Right.
Which is still a mammoth, wild leap.
Yeah.
You can get, people will agree with you on some stuff right off the bat, I think.
Yeah, I think so. But especially coming from, all the people in my general circles are all evangelical Christians, and that's a kind of it's a large leap. Something I've kind of come up with in just years of thinking about this is trying to mesh the two. It kind of works, but kind of doesn't work in a lot of ways. Obviously, it doesn't work with the evangelical thing because there's no evolution in there, and the earth is 4,000 years old or whatever. But it seems to me that a Christian should be like, well, maybe not a Christian, but somebody who believes in God would be all about, well, okay, I kind of approach it this way. I don't even use this language. God made the world a certain way. God made humans to be a certain way in relationship to the earth. And I think it's this, like, sometimes that kind of eases it into there a little bit. But in your opinion, how do you use what's religion play in your life, if at all, any?
Well, I'll tell you something that hits me over the head time and time again. An encounter I had in Turkey, and I don't remember when this was. It was probably around 2004 or 5 or something like that. Uh, anyway, I got to be over there and give some talks, and this young woman said in the Q&A, she said, I think it based this green anarchy thing, this primitivist thing, is it based a spiritual movement. And I was just clobbered by that. Unfortunately, she had to run and catch a bus. She wasn't at liberty to hang around and talk because I wanted to hear more.
Right.
And that just opened up another total thing to me. And I began to discover not so much a Christian thing, although that's in there too with these what are they called? Jesus. What are they called? I've been to a couple of their gatherings, and I was kind of astounded at how primitivist they were, and also devout Christians, by the way.
I'm curious about that too. You can't recall what it is, huh?
It's kind of faded away. I don't know if their websites are still operating, but they were. They're very Christian, but they don't want religion. I was just dumbfounded. I was just being in these workshops, and I'd never heard it put that way at all.
Yeah.
It's not orthodox. In fact, they don't seem to want to have a church. And man, they were. I remember the first time I was in Memphis. I was invited to one of these things in Memphis. So I pull up, and here's all these just classic primitivist kids, punk kids, in the parking lot. They're drinking beer. They just look like any other bunch of young, rowdy, let's rumble with the pigs kind of bunch. Well, devout Christians at the same time. I was just blown away. I couldn't even. My mouth just hung open.
Now
they had all things going on. Just for the moment, if you want to know more where I'm at, what this young woman said about the spiritual thing really opened some doors, and I found out that there were other anarchists who were kind of afraid to admit their spiritual side, and they didn't. And we began to think that the primitivist thing, there are spiritual values to me, like wholeness, immediacy. These are kind of, you could say, they're sort of core spiritual values, and I think they're at the heart of what primitivist is. What we're trying to go for, what kind of world we want,
right?
What kind of world, how do we interact with other human beings? I don't know if I'm making it very clear, but
no, I hear you. I mean, that's the kind of things that I think. But just to clarify, when you say like you're in like a meeting and there's a bunch of like primitivist kids or whatever, what does that mean?
Well, you mean in general, not necessarily spiritual or religious stuff?
No, I'm just thinking like when you say that, what does these kids look like? Because I don't ever meet these kids, or is this like a specific conference?
Well, I guess what I'm referring to personally is what happened here in Eugene 20 years ago or so. Explosion of anarchist stuff, and not just here. That was the anti-globalization movement from about 99 to 2001. It sort of ended with the 9/11, right? But it was going strong. There were 300,000 people in the streets of Genoa in late July 2001, and it was open warfare. It was a battle. People were throwing the computers out the window. This was. I'm not saying they were all primitivist anarchists,
right?
But some of them were. The young guy I'm looking at his painting over here, shot in the face by Carbonieri and killed. It was open. It was an open battle.
Wait, he was shot by what? Who?
Carbonieri. They're the most brutal Italian cops.
What?
Anyway, it was man, buildings were burned. I wasn't there.
And this is in protest of like, globalism and capitalism.
Yeah,
all this?
exactly. The world system, the integrated capitalist thing. That's
right.
And it's been kind of overlooked because that came and went. Came and went.
I could share. I have a story that I haven't shared this on this channel yet, but it's in this kind of vein. Is my family comes from, so my grandma came from an island in the Philippines called Sibuyan, and it's called like basically I think like the Canary Islands of the Philippines. It's very, very out there. It's like there's species that only appear there and things like this. One of the most untouched places in the Philippines.
Wow.
And one of my uncles, his name is Ariel. He was fighting because there was miners that were coming to try to take the copper and all this stuff. And he got together a bunch of people to protest. And he was fighting with the governments and all these things. And eventually, I guess one of the miners shot him and killed him in cold blood. God. And it's funny, like you can't find any information on this at all. There's like one weird video on YouTube. But I'd love to I went to Sibuyan last year, and I'd love to go back and kind of talk to people about it because it's so dear to my heart now as an environmentalist and all this. But it's amazing how it can come to that, like just fighting for the earth. Yeah,
it's all in there. I think I wish I could think of her name. Famous novelist in India. She gave this speech quite a lot called "Leave the Bauxite in the Mountains." In other words, leave the native people alone. The Adivasi, as they call them there in India. So, but the question is, right away, well, you leave the bauxite in the mountains. How do you have industry? How do you have cars?
Yeah.
And she wasn't quite willing to push that. We were meeting with her, and primitivists, so we go, exactly. You don't want the cars. Fuck the cars.
Yeah.
The logic of it is there.
Mm-hmm.
You can't just say leave it alone. I mean, you can because you're on the side of the indigenous people there, but go all the way with it. Anyway,
right. Totally.
You know what I mean? It's kind of there in that particular little thing, I guess.
Let me ask you this while it's on my mind. I have a buddy he's like a big open thinker too, and he's open to anything, but he kind of is aware of the world of primitive anarchism, but he kind of goes like this other route of he thinks there's some potential future in which like a leftist cabal can come up with the solutions to all the problems, but it's like a technological thing. And I guess I kind of hope that that's true, but it seems like the amount of like destruction wrought on the earth to get there, is it morally worth it, or is it even possible? You probably heard of this. How would you respond to something like that?
Well, I don't think it's possible. I think the logic of civilization is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
As the Joseph Tainer, the Fall of Complex Societies, beautiful book, came out in the 80s. He said simply, complex societies, civilizations, fail because they are parasites that consume their host. Game over.
Yep.
Then that's the gas. It's finished.
Yep.
And that's what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
Without a doubt. It's just everything's being ruined, contaminated, extracted, all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever it is, lithium. Now it's the chimera of lithium batteries that unfortunately tend to burst into flames.
Cool.
But never mind. We're going to mine the Salton Sea, which is so toxic in California. And then you add more toxins. You toxify it even more in pursuit of something that's basically toxic.
Right.
And then you finish. You just you poison everything and it's all over. That's exactly what's going on. Is anybody not noticing that?
No, I mean, I think some people think like, well, yeah, of course it's bad for it, but it does so much good, right? That does so much good.
It's hard to see the good. And the leftists, they're always talking about capitalism, like Noam Chomsky, who hates us. He just hates us. He's livid. He wants to get rid of capitalism. Okay, fine. So do I. So what then? You got socialism, and you get the same mechanisms, the same basic shit going on that started with domestication and runs its course in civilization. Mm-hmm. That doesn't do you any good.
Right.
It may be slightly better than naked capitalism or something, but it's fatal. It's not going to rescue anything. It's just deepening the problem as we see it. And he just won't even. He goes crazy when he hears about any primitive.
I lost you for a second.
It's
Hold up.
craziness. Why are there 7 billion people in the first place? Start with that question for one.
Yep.
What drives the crazy population thing in history? It's exactly these institutions, domestication and then industrialism. That's why there's 7 billion people. I guess he wants to have 50 billion people. And then it'll really be wonderful, won't it? I mean, what a nightmare. I can't believe his thinking is so shallow.
I was just listening to a thing where it was an interview with Jordan Peterson and somebody else a long time ago. And she was bringing up, she's a British politician, I think. She was bringing up the population thing. And Jordan Peterson, he just kind of poo-pooed it. Like, he thinks that there will never be an end to the petroleum, the whatever, the gas resources or whatever. And he thinks that the science says that the Earth can handle something like 9 billion people or whatever. Where does that come from? Like, who's coming out with these numbers?
Yeah, you wonder. Yeah, I don't know. It's I just really, it strikes me also. There's a certain amount of racism involved. There's a certain amount of white privilege. Yeah, you can dream all these things. You're fine. You're comfortable, and it's rather easy to overlook the reality in most of the world. For one thing.
Yes.
That doesn't make it. That's just a part of it.
One more thing that's on my mind. I was just having a disagreement with my brother-in-law about batteries, because he was listening to a podcast about what's better, battery cars or diesel or like gas cars, and they always come up with that battery cars are net better for the world, like with carbon emissions and stuff like this.
No,
but I mean, is that true? I mean, but obviously the lithium mining and all this stuff. I mean, are they taking everything into account? Recycling, I mean,
well,
but
no, they're not.
right?
I mean, you could easily say electric cars pollute less once you operate them, but what about building them? What about the mining and everything else that goes into producing them? I mean, that's, again, it's easier to look at, among other things, the end product, like the computer. It's shiny and clean. It's sitting on the shelf. Well, what's required to have that? A friend of mine in Detroit used to say, this cracked me up. He'd say, like arguing with a leftist, for example, well, you can't be serious. You don't want all this stuff to go away. What are you talking about? And he'd always go, do you want to go down in the mines? Do you want to go? And he'd go, well, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And he would say, you'd have to put a gun to my head to make me go down in a mine, dude. And would you go? No, of course, they just imagine that there's going to be this, infinite proletariat who will take care of it for them, while they die of, the latest contamination. I mean, it's to me, it's just that simple. You want to go down in the mine? I don't. And I don't want anyone else to either.
No. Yeah, nobody.
So how do you get it done?
Right.
It's simplistic, but there it is.
That's a good response. So when I bring these things up to my peers, they just make me feel like they'll say stuff like, "Well, you're a nihilist" or whatever. Or it's so negative and all this stuff. I've learned to be at peace with that. I'm trying to learn how to be a human, and I want to experience what being truly human's like. I want to eat food right out of the earth. I want to experience the sun on my face. I want to experience real human communication and things that the earth raised us to be. We evolved to do. So that's kind of like my purpose in life. I want to, and when I'm talking to Christians, I'll say, this is what God created us for. Like, how are you going to argue with that? But so how do you deal with it, like as a man, in your daily life, but you're looking around the world and just seeing just the craziness going around, and how do you deal with people calling you a nihilist or whatever, right?
Well, I think that's I've been accused of the opposite quite a lot more. I mean, of being a sunny, hippie, super optimist, full of hope. And I sort of am. I was sort of marked by the 60s, to tell you the truth. I'm aware of that. I mean, I get more mocked on that score than being a nihilist.
Oh, really? Well, how do I do that? How do I come off more like that?
Well, all of these things, I think they do present themselves in a certain way. For example, what you're just talking about, what you would like to experience as a human being, one of the big ones is community. Everybody wants community, right? Can you find somebody who doesn't want it? Well, it's gone.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yep.
Mass society made it go away. What would it take to get that back? I think face to face is the only real community. The rest of it is kind of a joke.
Yep.
And if you want that, well, then you're a primitivist pretty much already, right?
Yeah.
Think about what it takes to have face-to-face community. That would be just so enormously radical a change, and that's what I get back to. And it seems you can make it seem a little more practical in a sense. I lived in a housing co-op here in Eugene for 15 years, and it wasn't a hunter-gatherer band society, of whatever harmony there was, but it was about 50 people, and we were accountable. We were responsible to each other. We'd have these general meetings, and if somebody was screwing up, if somebody was pulling some shit, they had to deal with the group. I mean, we were communicating straight up.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't call the whoever if you have a problem. Call the expert, call the cops, whatever. And again, I'm not saying this was fantastic utopia, but it made me think it would be something like this, small scale, where you can be face to face and you can take responsibility. In fact, you have to take responsibility.
Right.
And I don't think people would, argue against that or see it as that utopian. I mean, it doesn't exist much, of course, needless to say, in modern society, only little pockets. And of course, we were part and parcel of the dominant society. We didn't live on some other planet, but we did. There were parts of it that were very healthy, and I learned a lot from that.
Let me ask you this. God, I got so many questions. I watched a thing on. I guess there's still like as close as you can get to primitive hunter-gatherer tribes out there. And like, people go over there with their GoPros and stuff and film them. I don't know how they do that without freaking them out, but I guess a lot of them are aware of civilization and they've kind of opted out or whatever.
Yeah.
And he asks them some questions about life, and he asks this one guy, he says, "What's the most important thing in life?" And John, I want you to guess what he says.
What the indigenous person said?
Yeah. He's a hunter-gatherer.
Uh-huh.
And he says meat.
Meat.
Meat. And I thought, wow, that's so like just the basic needs. Like this is they're reliant on the earth, they're reliant on the weather, and they're reliant on all these things. And I just thought that was so interesting. And and he, like, as he's interviewing this guy, he's kind of got his eye on these trees over here because there's like a band of baboons over there that they're gonna go raid later and eat them or whatever. And he asked some different things about like the afterlife, and he had no idea about the afterlife. He thought he had these ideas of, we think that when our tribe members die, they go to the sun.
Oh.
That's interesting. And then he asked him about, well, what do you think about city food? And he says he doesn't like city food. He thinks it tastes bad. I thought that was awesome. And that's kind of like what I want to experience, right? Like I want to experience what it's like to eat food right out of the earth, what it's like to like hunt prey and things like this. But it just comes across to people as crazy. So how about this question? Is it possible for humanity, do you think it's possible to get off of this rock, the earth, and go somewhere else? Like, we've abused and used this planet, it's over. Or like, maybe you could pose it this way. This is what some of my friends say. We could like go up in a spaceship and we could have Netflix and foot massages all day long and not have to worry about destroying the planet. So we could live up here in a spaceship. The earth can do its thing down here. technology will get us there. Is that possible?
Well, no, again, what is the foundation of technology? What does it all rest on? Extraction, mining, smelting. That's the basic shit. You can't get around it. Somebody's got to do it. And
Right.
look at the total on things. I mean, that's just a fantasy, a rather dim-witted fantasy, if you ask me. That comes out of nowhere. It falls down from the heaven for you.
Yeah. Well, I think they're saying that like we extract all the as much iron as we can and as much lithium and everything. We just basically just extract everything from the planet and then make a big spaceship, an ark, and leave, and then the Earth will recover and do its thing, and then we can just be, technocrats up in the sky and not have to worry about plaguing the Earth. Is that like?
Well, you're plaguing somewhere else. I mean, you're just moving the fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, because you need resources, right?
Fantasy.
Where are you going to get them from? Some comets or something?
It doesn't come out of the air. It's
Mm-hmm.
ultimately it's the nuts and bolts. Say, I wonder, Jonathan, if you run into a book called "Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes."
I've never heard of that.
I thought I'd bring it up, especially talking to you. It's a book. It's about linguistics essentially, but it's about an evangelical missionary who goes to some part of the Amazon with his wife, and the linguistic part of he's trying to learn their language so that he can provide a translation of Christian texts. The Old Testament, New Testament, all that. Well, he's trying to get to know them. He's trying to tell them about Jesus and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And to make a long story short, what he finds is that they're living this very, very direct life, like you were, describing or hoping for, such that they have no idea what he's talking about. It has no meaning to them. And actually, he drops the Christian missionary thing, and decides they have a lovely way of existing. And by the way, he discovers that the Chomskyan theory of language, that all language is essentially the same. There's this universal grammar. I'm not going to go off into that, but he disproves that utterly. They have communication, but they don't. In no way do they automatically have what we think of as symbolic language. They just don't. So it's another person who's hated by Chomsky.
We're out for Chomsky today, aren't we?
Well, yeah. I'm sorry. I mean, he's been such a pain in the ass, and he's holding things back, and him and the rest of the left.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about the appeal, we're trying to suss out the appeal of these ideas, or how do you, get people to listen a little more to what we're talking about. One thing that gets me in terms of American history, colonial history, have you heard the expression "gone to Croatan"?
No.
Well, most simply is colonists in droves escaped from the colonies, from the religious strictures and all the rest of it. And I'm not just putting a blame on religion, I'm not. And joined the native people. Lots and lots of that. And you know what? Those who did, or put it this way, the indigenous people never joined the colonists. It's incredible. And those who did join the natives, the Indians, never came back.
Yeah, I believe it.
I mean, that's just stunning. You'd think, oh, that can't be true. I mean, come on. Well, It is true. It's true. So what does that tell you? I mean, that's a powerful thing, if you ask me.
Yeah, that's incredibly powerful.
For civilization and join these primal people.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess why? I mean, count the blessings. I mean, it's there. They did it. They made that choice.
Mm-hmm. I think it's evident to see people that are whole and happy and healthy. And I mean, what more do you want? I mean, it's right there. Let me ask you this. I think about the earth, and I think about my body and how, like, this thing that I think is me is just a colony, right? It's like bacteria and it's like other stuff, right? and the earth is like that, and we're a part of that. That's kind of a freaky thing to think about. Like we're like a microcosm of the earth, right? I mean, is this part of like the idea of? I know that's a little bit more like kind of woo woo than like the primitivist stuff, but it's something that I've kind of like stumbled across as going down the road of like being closer to the earth. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, I like that. I think that's great. That's the kind of consciousness that gets away from all these dominant paradigms and these false paths. It seems to me, what you just said. I mean, if you meditate on that, well, it kind of tells you how it works, what's important.
And another thing that actually my sister brought this up is trying to like kind of get like some Christian ideas into this whole thing. There's this idea in my brand of Christianity that like we got to rely on God for all our needs. And when we try to like do it in our own power, like kind of make it happen, that's the bad thing. Because we want to rely fully on God for everything we need. And I thought we want to apply that to our lives in every possible way except for like food and like shelter and things like this, right? Because if we just relied fully on God to provide our needs, isn't that hunting and gathering?
You mean the reliance on something outside yourself? I mean,
well, like God, the creator, he provides the trees. It's like a Genesis thing. He provides the trees, he provides the beasts of the field, fully relying on God and not on ourselves. Because like I'm seeing the world is we're doing it in our own power. We're like engineering things to feed ourselves, and we're like taking advantage of the animals and putting everything in a bin and in a machine in a factory to like, right? This is like us doing it by our own power, but relying on God to provide our needs. That seems to me to be fully embodied in a hunter-gatherer lifestyle. Does that ring true at all?
Well, I don't know. Frankly, I'm not a believer. God is a strange concept to me. And you won't find any indigenous people, any pre-civilized people who believe in that stuff, frankly. I mean, I look at it more like Gaia. That's the spiritual thing. And maybe it's saying pretty much the same thing you are.
Yeah.
Part of it's all alive and should be treated as such, as worthy in itself, or as Native people say, it's sacred. It's all sacred. Mm-hmm. And wow, if you started looking at it that way, we wouldn't be doing what we're doing, So
yeah,
that's another way to put it,
Certainly. I also was going to ask you about. I listened to this thing about trees and how I think this has been around for a while. How they're figuring out that trees are communicating with like the fungus in the ground and things like this.
Yeah.
I mean, are we starting to understand as humans and as creatures, like, because the evolution of humanity has been kind of weird. Like in the technological era, we all of a sudden, like, where do you think it started? Like all of a sudden humans think we're above creation. We're like special, right? And then we start kind of like, well, all the other creatures are just something else. And, when did that happen?
I think it happened with domestication.
You're probably right.
Domination of nature, and that's where private property stems from, and pretty much everything starts there.
Yeah.
It's control ethos.
Right.
There's always more control. I mean, domestication doesn't seem to end. Maybe we'll have to end it because it just keeps on going. And that's the logic of it. It really did start from there, and then everything else is, you're off to the races. You're not accepting nature and living with it and, respecting it. You're out there to plow up those fields and put up those fences and store that grain and, establish more and more complex societies with, more and more hierarchy, the whole ball game.
And then all of a sudden it's like it kind of compounds, right? Because it's like, well, who's going to be in charge of this surplus of food? Well, it's going to be the strongest and the males or whatever.
Exactly. And you need somebody. You could call it coordination, but it's really control it. But hunter-gatherer, in a more direct way, the way they operated, in the classic mobile hunter-gatherers, they were not all of them were, moving all the time, but there were, millions of cases where they had maybe a summer camp or a winter camp, or maybe 2 or 3 places during the year where they would go. They didn't lug all kinds of furniture and crap. They didn't even have a concept of private property, really,
Right.
because it was more the group, spending for each other.
Mm-hmm.
Great
And
stuff.
yeah, I mean that's it, and then but all of a sudden, like, would the numbers get bigger in these tribes? Isn't this where like the idea of like divine retribution comes in? Like, because there's ideas of like, well, if there's too many people, we can't trust each other. So how do we
Yeah.
unite together? Well, if we all believe in the same kind of religion or whatever, then we have a common thing that we can trust each other, right? And then you have the evolution of religion, right? Am I saying that in a coherent way?
Well, you could look at it another way. I mean, for quite a while, I think the standard notion was after you get a certain number of people, the population, you have to start farming. You have to do domestication,
Mhm.
right? Well, now we look at it quite differently, and I think the literature reflects this pretty well. It wasn't that the population caused the agriculture; it was the agriculture that caused the big surge in population.
Yes.
So once you get back to domestication once again as a kind of prime mover, because you could check it out in another way. I mean, Homo species goes back well over 1 million years. We had the use of fire over 1 million years. There was no population explosion. Band societies, small scale face-to-face stuff, that was the norm forever.
Mhm.
And then it changed overnight, pretty much, like 9,000-10,000 years ago with agriculture, with domestication. There you have it. I mean, it's a simple case study. I mean, otherwise you could say, well, it must have been, say, fire was the problem. That put us on the wrong course. Well, you could say that, but how come nothing went south until another million years went by?
Right.
So probably it wasn't fire,
Yeah, I mean, and that's the question that people ask me about this is like, well, what's the line? Like, can we have bow and arrows? Can we have fire? Can we have clothes?
Yeah.
Like, but I think saying like domestication, that to you is the line, right?
Yeah, and I think even before that, what seems to set the stage for it is division of labor. In other words, you start having seemingly these gradations of authority, and maybe the shaman was the first one who had, some effective power over other people. I'm not saying it was evil. In some cases, it wasn't so good. But then you have some hierarchy starting to creep in, and that's what really enables the domestication jump off, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So you can sort of test these things. Which tools are fine and roughly egalitarian, and which are kind of starting to be in the hands of experts,
Mm-hmm.
and other people,
Mm-hmm.
have to rely on the experts. I mean, you can see that's where the bad stuff starts to creep in, and then with domestication, it's all over, really.
Yeah. And I think about that a lot since I listened to that interview that you were on, like that specialization is a kind of an emergent thing from domestication where you have a surplus and then all of a sudden you can have specialization, right? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the specialization is even more primary, and that's what goes on right now. You can ask any economist in the world what drives the economy, what drives development, all the rest of it. Well, it's division of labor. That's not some radical secret or some
No, yeah.
anarchist notion. That's just the way it is. More and more and more specialization, and that's what makes the world go around.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately,
Right.
That's pretty basic.
Do you think it's inevitable that a creature like us could evolve and invent domestication?
Well, I think what's overlooked a lot is that there was a big battle. It wasn't more like, well, that sounds like a good idea. Why don't we try farming? Why don't we do that? Let's give it a go. Actually, and one really good book on subject is Stanley Diamond, In Search of the Primitive. And he really brings it out. He calls it a titanic battle between people, hunter-gatherers who wanted freedom and mobility and equality, that sort of stuff. And
Who's the author of that? Kotlow?
no, Stanley Diamond. And this book goes way back to the 70s. I think it came out in the mid-70s. In Search of the Primitive. He points out that it weren't no automatic, just some spontaneous, let's go for this. It really was resisted a huge amount in various parts of the world, and it still is resisted in some places. And in some cases, maybe rare cases, but they went back the other way, like gone to Croatan. Screw this. This is too much work.
Yeah.
And it's not really paying off. We're dependent on one basic crop, or the whole monoculture, industrial culture, agriculture thing, that where it leads is not too nice.
So I mean, I get that, like, humanity, it's kind of gotten to the point, like, it's all over now, right? I mean, it's one giant empire of the capitalist kind of colonizing thing, right? Yeah. But like, if we drive ourselves into extinction, is it just going to happen again?
Oh, you mean why wouldn't it start all over if we got rid of civilization?
Well, like, if like Homo erectus went extinct, would just another, because it pretty much takes two things, like, it's like language and like opposable thumbs, right? I mean, these are like the things that can create the domestication, right? I mean, isn't just the next ape in line going to come and develop this level of consciousness and language, and then all of a sudden you have it all over again?
Well, I guess the only argument against that is, why on earth would you want to do it if you could see where it leads?
Well, like, the next primate in line doesn't. Well, do they? I guess, are they aware that we're doing this? Maybe, but how are they going to stop it?
There's a novel by what is the name of that thing? Oh, Ridley Walker, and it's about these people far in the future, maybe a couple hundred years after everything's been collapsed and ruined and done. Well, they're digging, they find this plane, and they realize that this was something that was able to fly, this big metal thing. And half of the people want to go for it. Wow, this would be fantastic. How do we get to be able to do that? And the other half say, look, it ruined the earth. That's why it's under the earth. I mean, it all went south. It was a terrible idea. So the whole novel revolves around the clash, that choice.
What's that book called? That sounds awesome.
I think it's called. It's not the author. It's actually called Ridley Walker.
Oh,
and it's written in this language, sort of, I guess you might call it Pidgin English, where centuries later it's sort of like English, and you can pretty much make it out, but it has that authentic quality of maybe people would sound like this, when they're talking. So It's really, this is a guy, God, I can't think of his name, mostly famous for children's books, if that helps run it down.
When I'm Googling it says the author is Russell Hoban.
Yes, that's the guy who wrote it.
That's cool.
You might really enjoy it.
I'm going to check that out. That sounds really interesting.
It's just what we're talking about.
Because I've thought about like a science fiction movie where, like, civilization collapses, and then, like, there's people that realize that it was technology that brought us here, so they have to hide it from, like, the generations past, and then they, like, stumble upon it, and they have to, like, bury it and all this stuff. I could see that being a really provocative movie.
Well, that's the way it was when, like, I was poking around with the early factory system, and those people that invented those power looms and all that stuff, they had to hide their workshops. They were spit upon in the street because people did not want to get herded into the factories and become the wonderful Marxian proletariat. No, they did not want that. And now, who gets lionized all the time? These Musk and these people that, they're the big heroes to some anyway. That what geniuses.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I mean, the
there's a
hard
change.
thing the hard thing is that they have the ace in the hole like argument that like we're going to do this because it's going to save this many lives, right? We're going to invent this new thing and it's going to save this many lives. We're going to invent, autonomous cars because it's going to save 2 billion people on the road. I mean, how do you argue with that? I mean, without saying
Well,
there's too
I'll
many
tell you
people
one way.
anyway, you know what I mean?
You can point out that time and time again, the power or the authority that promises to fix something actually caused the problem. Okay, this is what I mean. Technology in general. Okay, we're going to cure cancer. What causes the cancer, dude? I mean, come on.
Right.
You can just reverse it almost every time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that'd be wonderful. We'll have all these wonder drugs, and no, you got to look at what the beginning of it is. What the logic of it is. How do we get to this place where we're dependent on whether it's drug technology or whatever it is? And we're all held hostage to it. I'm not saying we're not. I mean, if I have any health things, I'm going to go to the doctor. I'm not going to say, oh, I transcend that. We're all stuck, and so you're caught in that web where they make these claims and these promises, and you want to believe it because here we are, we're stuck. So and so that's part of the argument too, where you got the inertia where people sort of have to believe in it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's sad, but there we are.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can kind of think through it, then maybe there's a different way to go.
Do you identify as a Luddite?
Oh yes, at
Okay.
least.
Because I got called that, and I thought, should I be offended? Because I don't know what it is, but it's just like somebody who doesn't like technology, right?
Well, yeah, in the original Luddite risings in England between 1810 and 1820, there were three distinct ones, and it's probably apocryphal, but the story goes there was this guy in the factory who was just fed up with the sweat work, and he took a sledgehammer to the loom, and they called him Captain Ludd, and it became this whole uprising.
Well, why did they call him that?
In the textile factory.
What's Ludd?
I don't know where that word comes from, but I guess that was his name.
Oh, okay.
So he was Captain Ludd. It's kind of a mythical figure.
Yeah.
It just swept across England, and not just in the textile factories. It was enormous. The British had to have more troops to quell that than at the time they had in the field to try to defeat Napoleon. This is the time of the Napoleonic Wars.
I mean, isn't that the thing that the guy talks about, like the proletariat rising up? Like, isn't that the big danger that they're always worried about?
Well, yeah, but they didn't want to be proletariats. That's the thing. They wanted to be, for example, the handloom weavers, autonomous people on the land, weaving in their family kind of thing,
right?
Scattered around, and but Marx wanted them all bunched together, grouped together in this blob. Only then would they be powerful. No, only then they would be more domesticated. In fact, domesticated. Period. That was just awful idea.
So you're
fascist idea in my view.
That thing you just said is like anti-Marxism.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm just making sure. I'm not super educated on that whole thing, but I know that like a lot of this just promotes more more technology and more.
Yeah, exactly. That's the path. I've written a couple of things. You could Google my name and put Luddite in there, and I think it would pop up stuff I've written about on the subject.
Let me ask you about cancer, because I've thought about this. Cancer is like cells that mutate, and then they stop dying, and they just keep replicating over and over and over. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Norman Mailer has an interesting, I don't agree with Norman Mailer on everything, but he said cancer is when we turn against ourselves. When we're so unhappy, we breed these unhealthy cells that try to gobble everything up. In other words, he saw this pathology as having to do with society, and how we're not healthy, and this is a disease of being trapped in society, and like other things too. I mean, you could say, well, that's enough on that.
Well, what about I just watched these long videos on these rat experiments they did, the mice utopia. Have you heard it? You remember that whole thing?
No, I don't know about that.
Okay, well, it reminded me of like I guess they were trying to do experiments on like populations. So they had these mice and they built these cages, like big cages that could hold like whatever 1,000 mice. And they noticed that as their numbers got bigger, like they started to get into bands, and like the big males would take over these quadrants, and they provided them with everything they need, all the food, all the water, all the nesting material they ever needed. And then but then as the numbers got bigger, they had to quarantine, like they started like fighting, and then they started eating the babies, and then the mothers couldn't raise the kids anymore, and then they started hurting their own children, and it got insane. Like it's so creepy to hear this. And like I guess at the towards the very end, where the population started going down, this weird kind of group of males emerged that they called the beautiful ones, because they wouldn't fight anymore. They wouldn't do anything except eat and drink and groom themselves. And so they were just like these perfect looking rats, mice or whatever. And then they wouldn't breed. They had no interest in sexual activity at all. And even when introduced into new populations, they just were completely changed. And I thought, is there any, these are experiments, and then this got out at some point, and people made movies about it, and they thought, is this going to happen to humanity? I mean, is that what we're seeing? Like, because we're not. I mean, we're kind of overcrowded in a lot of ways, like in the cities.
Yeah.
But socially, is that kind of what's happening? Like we're turning against each other, and it's just unhealthy. And I mean, does that like analogous to you at all?
Well, in a general sense, I mean, the amount of anxiety and depression and loneliness is just through the roof. There's just such a gigantic literature on it now. You can't get away from it, and how bad it is for your health, and how we have fewer friends, and it just, it's everything. As civilization starts to, I think, near the end, nothing is unaffected, including our own psychological or spiritual being. It's very nasty. It's just, and it just keeps getting worse. The pandemic is not just the physical plague part of it, but how hard it's been on people just to, maintain relationships and think straight and all the rest of it. And that didn't happen overnight, but it's sadly it's getting worse. It's really the amount of billions of dollars spent on pharmaceutical drugs, well, drugs of all kinds, legal and illegal. It seems like almost everybody needs drugs to get through the damn day. How did that happen? That didn't used to be the case.
Isn't that wild?
And these people that say, "Oh, it's just fine, keep going," wow, I don't know what world they're describing.
What do you think about? Did technology create the coronavirus, or is that a conspiracy theory?
Well, I think you're getting more and more. These things are, whether it's Ebola or Zika or SARS or West Nile, they're just coming one after the other, and there'll be more and more one after another. It's just how unhealthy civilization is becoming.
Because if it's not the proximity to animals in the farms that's going to create viruses, it's going to be science that's creating viruses and letting them out in the world, right?
Well, I think they're both true. I mean, as we encroach on the habitat of animals in the wild, then we're jamming it up. We're invading these spaces, and then you get results that shouldn't occur if there were fewer people and we weren't paving everything and marching into these areas that should be left alone. But I think all this stuff works together. Sadly enough, it's really a pretty integrated totality where everything starts to go south. I mean, I think that's the way it works.
Mm-hmm. Well, I've detained you for enough time, but how about you plug your book and give us a little a synopsis before I let you go.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan. Here we go.
A little higher. There it is. What's it called? When We Are? Oh, sorry. Wait, hold on, John. I think you muted yourself. Let me see if I can unmute you. There you go.
Are we back?
Yep.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's a collection of essays. Virtually all my books are I didn't sit down to write a book, but it's like 20 different essays. Some are pretty short, and people could probably just sample through it, see what topic they might be more interested in. It just came out last week.
That's great. I'm gonna pick up a copy, but I'm also gonna put all the stuff that you recommended in the description, so we can all check that out later.
Yeah, I really enjoyed talking with you, man.
That was awesome. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it, and I hope that people are open-minded, and I hope that we can all figure out what it means to be human living on a planet. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Good luck with your project.
All right. Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
You too. Take
Bye.
care.
Another lovely day as the children play. I think to myself.